True or false? Racism causes hypertension, depression, anxiety, and death. What say you? So for those of you that say true, you are onto something. 40 years ago, a young black girl attended a predominantly white school. So one day in her history class, the teacher decided to go around the room asking the students what they wanted to be when they grew up. So she was excited because she already knew what she wanted to be. She had known that since she was 2 years old. So when it was her turn, she said excitedly, "I want to be a doctor." And the teacher threw her head back and laughed. The class went silent as they watched the teacher's reaction. And the teacher turned to the girl and said, "You are ambitious." So she smiled, thinking she was being paid a compliment. And then the teacher went on to say, "Our Negroes do pretty well. You're smart, so you'll get a good job as an office assistant." That smile was wiped off her face. It was replaced with a lump in her throat and tears in her eyes. I was that young girl. I was broken. My teacher had no idea of the power of the words that she so nonchalantly uttered, nor did she know how it would affect me in the long run. At first, it was the sense of shame. I was embarrassed. I thought I was not enough. I was just wasting my time. If my teacher felt like I couldn't do it, who was I to think that I could do it? Then depression set in, followed by anger. Because as I played that scenario over and over and over in my head, I realized that she did not say that to anybody else in the class who had said they wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer. Then I became anxious. For weeks, I would panic if I had to take a test, doubting myself, scared to put pen to paper, scared to answer questions in class. But then I also knew that if my grades dropped, so would my chances of ever becoming a doctor. There was just so much pressure. Luckily for me, my parents started to notice that something was different. I was jittery and more irritable, and they asked me about it, and I shared it with them. And in my parents' true fashion, they told me to pray about it and forgive it. And so I did. I gave it to God. Because had I not, I would have more than likely ended up with pathological levels of hypertension, depression, and anxiety. My experience could have led to disastrous consequences, and depending on my own inner strength, could have ultimately led to suicide. So my example is only one of many of how racism can lead to disastrous consequences. There are published studies that provide evidence that discrimination is associated with elevated levels of activity in a part of the brain called the amygdala and functional capabilities. What does this mean? This means that there is a clear parallel or clear parallels between the neural substrates in the brain and psychological stressors that can lead to adverse physical and mental health outcomes. So in layman's terms, this means that people are not just playing the race card. This is for real. Exposure to racism or discrimination is a well-established factor for mental health disorders, including depression, anxiety, and PTSD. At the time, I didn't know any of this. I only knew that I had to forgive because it was the Christian thing to do. I had no idea of the benefits of forgiveness. I knew that I felt better after I did. I no longer had that sense of shame, and I was no longer afraid to speak in public. What I didn't know was that forgiveness is positively associated with many facets of well-being. It has protective implications against depression and anxiety. There is a part of the brain called the middle frontal gyrus. The volume in the middle frontal gyrus is associated with depression and anxiety. Science tells us today that forgiveness mediates the relationship between the middle frontal gyrus volume and both depressive and anxiety levels. Who knew? Unbeknownst to me, forgiveness is made out of cognitive, behavioral, motivational, and effective changes that promote positive social change in oneself and with others. It has been shown in the literature to be protective against depression and high blood pressure. So let me go back to my original question. True or false? Racism causes depression, hypertension, anxiety, and death. For those of you that say false, I hope that I have given you and provided you some insight and food for thought about the disastrous effects of racism. I challenge each and every one of you to delve deeper into the information that I have shared with you today.